My name is Nia Sterling, 34 years old, and somehow still healing from the wounds my in-laws inflicted. As a successful software developer and business owner, I thought I had secured my peace. Last week, after my husband died, his family from Chicago came and declared they wanted the entire estate, the company, everything. My attorney begged me to fight, but I said let them have it all. Everyone thought I was crazy. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. They smiled until their attorney turned pale when he read what was written in them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, I was raised by my grandmother, a hardworking nurse everyone called Big Mama. She taught me the value of a dollar, the importance of education, and the necessity of keeping a steel spine in a world that would constantly try to bend me. I took those lessons, poured my heart into technology, and eventually founded my own software company specializing in supply chain logistics. I was proud of my roots. But to my husband David and his family, my background was a stain on their pristine Gold Coast image. David Sterling was the golden child of a prominent, wealthy African-American family in Chicago. From the outside, our marriage looked like a modern fairy tale. We lived in a stunning penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. We attended high society galas. We sat in the front pews of the most exclusive church in the city. But inside the walls of that penthouse, the reality was suffocating. His family never accepted me. To them, I was just a charity case, a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who had somehow tricked their perfect son into putting a ring on her finger. The absolute worst of them all were my mother-in-law Beatrice, my brother-in-law Terrence, and his wife Vanessa. They operated like a pack of wolves, constantly circling, constantly waiting for a moment of weakness. That moment arrived on a rainy Tuesday when David died suddenly of a massive heart attack. The funeral was a grand theatrical production orchestrated entirely by Beatrice. She treated her son's death like a red carpet event, ensuring every influential politician, business leader, and church elder was present to witness her performative grief. I sat in the front pew, exhausted, heartbroken, and completely numb. I had just lost my husband, the man I had shared 5 years of my life with, but I was not allowed to mourn in peace. I had to play the role of the stoic widow while Beatrice wailed for the cameras. After the burial, the repast was held at our penthouse. The massive living room was filled with catered food, expensive floral arrangements, and dozens of guests whispering in hushed tones. The air was thick with the smell of rich perfumes and the underlying tension of unspoken judgments. I could not take the suffocating atmosphere for another second. I retreated to the master powder room, locking the heavy mahogany door behind me. I leaned over the marble sink, splashing cold water on my face. My eyes were red and swollen from crying. My custom black dress felt like a straitjacket. I took a few deep breaths, trying to gather whatever strength I had left to face the crowd of people who were drinking my wine and eating my food while secretly dissecting my every flaw. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped out into the private hallway, I found my path completely blocked. Terrence was standing there, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing a tailored suit that I knew he could not actually afford, reeking of expensive cologne, and an overwhelming sense of entitlement. He did not look like a man who had just buried his brother. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. He did not offer me a word of comfort. He did not ask how I was holding up. Instead, he reached inside his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick legal document, and dropped it onto the marble console table next to me with a loud, dismissive thud. "The family attorney has the papers ready," Terrence said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You have 48 hours to pack your bags and get out of this penthouse. Sterling property belongs to blood Sterlings." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer cruelty of his words. David had been dead for less than 4 days. His ashes were barely settled in the family crypt, and his own brother was already launching an eviction notice at his grieving widow. Before I could even form a response, the shadows at the end of the hallway shifted. Beatrice and Vanessa stepped into the light, moving in perfect unison like predators sensing blood in the water. Beatrice was wearing a custom black morning dress and her signature strand of South Sea pearls. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin tilted upward in that familiar, aristocratic way she used whenever she wanted to make someone feel insignificant. Vanessa walked a half step behind her, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered across her face. "Let us not make this harder than it has to be," Beatrice said, her tone cold and commanding. "You always were a clever girl, Nia. Clever enough to climb your way out of the South Side and into my son's bed. But your luck has run out. You never fit into our circle, and you certainly do not belong in this penthouse. You are a gold digger who played her cards well, but the game is over." I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly by my sides. I refused to let them see me tremble. "You are doing this today?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low, "while your guests are eating in my dining room." "This is not your dining room," Beatrice snapped, stepping closer. "Nothing here is yours. You are going to sign over full control of Sterling Enterprises. David built that investment firm into a billion-dollar empire, and it belongs to this family. You are going to walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which is absolutely nothing." Vanessa chuckled, stepping out from behind Beatrice. She intentionally raised her voice, making sure her words carried down the hallway and into the main living area where several prominent church members, including Pastor Thomas, were gathered. "We all know David was the sole provider," Vanessa announced loudly, ensuring the church ladies could hear every word. "David gave you this lavish lifestyle. He let you play around with that cute little typing hobby you call a business. But let us be honest, Nia. A little software startup in a rented office does not pay for Italian marble and skyline views. You lived off my brother-in-law, and now that the bank is closed, it is time for you to go back to the neighborhood you came from." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. The church ladies in the next room fell silent, their ears practically pressed against the walls, eager to absorb the scandalous family drama. Vanessa looked at me with pure, unadulterated triumph, believing she had just publicly humiliated me into submission. They all stood there, a unified front of greed and malice waiting for me to break down. They expected me to fall to my knees. They expected me to scream, to cry, to beg for a piece of the pie. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. They had spent so much time looking down on me that they never actually bothered to look at me. They never bothered to understand the woman David had married. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly walked past Terrence, moving toward a small beverage cart positioned near the hallway entrance. I picked up a crystal glass, filled it with sparkling water from a glass pitcher, and added a single cube of ice. The gentle clinking of the ice against the crystal was the only sound in the dead silence of the hallway. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool water soothe my dry throat. Then I turned around and looked at the three of them. I did not look at them with the fear or desperation they so desperately wanted to see. I looked at them with absolute freezing calm. "David's grave has not even settled yet," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent penthouse. "And you are already here picking at his bones like vultures." Terrence scoffed, taking a threatening step forward. "Call it what you want, Nia. The paperwork is right there. You are going to sign it, or we are going to drag you through court until you do not have a single dime left to your name." I looked at the legal document resting on the marble table. I looked at Beatrice, whose eyes were shining with greedy anticipation. I looked at Vanessa, who was already mentally redecorating my living room. They wanted Sterling Enterprises. They wanted the legacy. They wanted the entire empire that David had supposedly built. I smiled. It was a small, subtle smile, but it made Beatrice flinch. "You know what I said," softly. "You are absolutely right. Sterling Enterprises and everything David owned belongs to his blood. I will gladly sign it all over to you." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. The soft jazz music playing from the living room speakers seemed to amplify the sudden heavy stillness in the hallway. Beatrice blinked, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitching in momentary confusion. Terrence dropped his aggressive stance, his broad shoulders slumping just a fraction as his brain struggled to process my lack of resistance. Vanessa simply stared, her mouth slightly parted, the cruel smirk frozen on her glossy lips. They had come to this hallway prepared for a war. They had armed themselves with insults, legal threats, and an audience of elite church members just a few feet away, fully expecting me to scream, throw things, and beg for my share of the sterling fortune. My immediate and total surrender broke their script. Beatrice was the first to recover. The confusion in her eyes rapidly dissolved into a gleam of predatory triumph. She adjusted her pearl necklace, standing even taller, her chest puffed out with the arrogant pride of a matriarch who believed she had just conquered an unworthy adversary. "I knew you would finally see reason," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "It is the only intelligent choice you have made since you forced your way into this family. You know as well as I do that you have absolutely no legal standing here. Not after the agreement we put in place." She was talking about the post-nuptial agreement. 5 years ago, just after David and I celebrated our first anniversary, Beatrice had staged a similar ambush. She had convinced David that my small emerging software company was a financial liability that could somehow drain the Sterling family trust if my business went under. She played on his ego and his hidden insecurities, demanding that we sign a post-nuptial agreement to completely and entirely separate our assets. At the time, David framed it as a standard procedure for high-net-worth families. He brought a team of corporate lawyers to our dining table, sliding a 50-page document in front of me. The contract explicitly stated that I would have absolutely no claim to Sterling Enterprises, no access to his investment portfolios, and no rights to any property acquired under the Sterling name, including this very penthouse. In exchange, my own business, which they viewed as a worthless typing hobby, would remain solely mine. I signed it without a single argument. I signed it because I never wanted their money. I only ever wanted to build my own legacy. But Beatrice always believed I signed it because I was foolish and intimidated by their wealth. "I made sure my son protected the Sterling legacy from outsiders like you," Beatrice boasted, taking a step closer to me, her expensive perfume clashing with the stale tension in the air. "I saw right through your innocent, hard-working facade from day one. I knew you were nothing but a South Side opportunist looking for a quick payday. I told David that a woman of your background could never handle the weight of real wealth. That is why I personally instructed his attorneys to draft that post-nuptial agreement. I firewalled our billion-dollar empire away from your greedy hands. You thought you could wait me out. You thought you could manipulate my son into changing his will. But I always win, Nia. You are leaving this marriage with exactly what you deserve." Terrence let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the marble walls. He clapped his hands together, stepping up beside his mother, his chest puffed out with unearned bravado. "You should be on your knees thanking us that we even let you sleep in this penthouse for the past 5 years." Terrence sneered, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You really thought you were going to inherit the keys to the kingdom? You thought you were going to sit in the CEO chair of Sterling Enterprises? Please, you do not have the intellectual capacity to run a real business." He leaned in closer, invading my personal space, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cheap arrogance. "Sterling Enterprises is a global investment powerhouse." He continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "We deal with real money. We manage real assets. You play around with computer codes and logistics software in some rented office space. You are out of your depth, Nia. You always were. You were just a pretty accessory for my brother to parade around at charity galas. Now that David is gone, your free ride is officially over. It is time for you to pack up your cheap clothes and go right back to the neighborhood you came from. The adults are taking over now." Vanessa could not resist joining the dog pile. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets catching the light. "Do not worry," Nia Vanessa chimed in, her voice artificially sweet. "We will make sure the movers do not scratch your little laptops when they pack you up. Maybe you can find a nice, affordable apartment somewhere past the expressway. Somewhere your kind of people live." They stood there, a united wall of bigotry, entitlement, and blind greed. They were practically salivating at the thought of taking over the company. They believed they were inheriting a bottomless gold mine. They believed they had outsmarted me, outmaneuvered me, and successfully discarded me like trash. I looked at their smug, greedy faces. I looked at Beatrice, who was already mentally planning how she would redecorate the penthouse. I looked at Terrence, who was undoubtedly calculating how many luxury cars he could buy with his new executive salary. I looked at Vanessa, who was just happy to see me lose. If I were the woman they thought I was, I would have broken down right then and there. I would have screamed about fairness. I would have cursed them for disrespecting my dead husband's memory. I would have called my lawyers to fight the post-nuptial agreement, dragging them into a bitter, years-long probate battle just out of pure spite. But I am not the woman they thought I was. I am the woman Big Mama raised. I am a woman who knows how to read the fine print. And I am a woman who understands that the most destructive weapon you can hand an arrogant fool is exactly what they are asking for. I maintained my absolute icy composure. I did not let a single trace of anger show on my face. Instead, I gave them the exact reaction they needed to fuel their massive egos. I lowered my gaze for a brief second, playing the part of the defeated, exhausted widow. When I looked back up at them, I let out a soft, resigned sigh. "You are right," I said, my voice steady, projecting the perfect illusion of a woman who had finally accepted her inevitable defeat. "I do not have the capacity to manage Sterling Enterprises. I never truly understood the magnitude of what David built, and I certainly cannot step into his shoes. The pressure is too much for me. I am just a software developer. I do not know anything about running a global investment firm." Terrence smirked, glancing at his mother in triumph. "This company belongs to the Sterling bloodline," I continued, meeting Beatrice's triumphant stare. "It belongs to you, Beatrice. It belongs to Terrence. You are the only ones equipped to handle the reality of David's financial legacy. I will not fight you. I will not contest the postnuptial agreement. I will not drag this family through the mud in probate court. I want a clean break. Have your attorney draft the absolute surrender of all my spousal rights to the estate. Once you present the final transfer documents, I will sign away my interest in Sterling Enterprises, the penthouse, and every single asset David left behind." Beatrice's eyes widened with sheer, unadulterated joy. She had won without firing a single legal shot. She had successfully bullied me into giving up everything. "I am glad you have finally found some common sense," Beatrice said smoothly, though she could not hide the predatory grin spreading across her face. "My attorney will have the transfer documents ready by tomorrow morning. I expect you to have your bags packed by the time the ink dries. We will need your keys to the company vehicles too," Terrence added, eagerly rubbing his hands together. "Do not think you are driving off in the Range Rover. You will have everything by Tuesday, I promised quietly. Enjoy your inheritance." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for another insult. I did not wait for Vanessa to throw another jab. I simply walked away, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Behind me, I could hear them celebrating. I could hear Terrence laughing and slapping the wall in victory. I could hear Beatrice praising her own brilliance for forcing the post-nuptial agreement years ago. They were reveling in my supposed destruction, entirely unaware of the catastrophic avalanche they had just invited into their lives. I walked past the dining room, ignoring the staring eyes of the funeral guests. I kept my posture straight, my head held high, projecting an aura of quiet dignity. I walked down the long, art-lined corridor toward the private sanctuary of my home office, the one room in the penthouse that I had paid for with my own money. I stepped inside and locked the heavy oak door behind me, shutting out the noise of the Sterling family's premature victory lap. The office was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the city lights pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked over to my desk, my sanctuary, the place where I had built my true empire, while they were busy playing dress-up. I picked up my cell phone from the leather desk mat. My hands were completely steady. My heart was beating with a slow, powerful rhythm. I unlocked the screen and scrolled to my speed dial. I pressed the name of my attorney, Kenneth Wright. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Nia," Kenneth said, his deep, resonant voice filled with professional concern. "How are you holding up? Did they try to ambush you at the repast?" "They did exactly what we knew they would do," I replied, staring out at the glittering skyline of Chicago. "They demanded the company, the penthouse, and the entire estate. They used the post-nuptial agreement as a weapon to demand my immediate eviction." Kenneth let out a heavy sigh over the line. "I told you they would be ruthless, Nia. We need to file an injunction immediately. I will not let them bully you out of your own home." "There will be no injunction, Kenneth." I said, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across my face. I gave them exactly what they asked for. I told them I am surrendering all my rights to the Sterling estate. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Nia, you cannot be serious. I am dead serious, I replied, my voice dropping to a cool, calculated whisper. The fish took the bait. They are blinded by their own greed. It is time. Prepare Exhibit B. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the Chicago skyline gleaming under a crisp, pale sunlight. I sat in the leather guest chair inside the downtown law office of Kenneth Wright. Kenneth was not just my attorney. He was a force of nature in the Chicago legal community. A seasoned, brilliant African-American man in his late 60s, he had taken me under his wing years ago. He had known Big Mama had respected her and treated me with the fierce protectiveness of a father. Right now, that protective instinct was in overdrive. Kenneth was pacing the length of his massive corner office. His polished wingtip shoes beat a frantic, rhythmic path across the Persian rug. The panoramic view of the city behind his desk seemed to frame his escalating frustration. He gripped a thick manila folder in his hands, occasionally waving it in the air like a weapon as he spoke. Nia, I am telling you, this is a catastrophic mistake, Kenneth said, his deep baritone voice rumbling with unchecked anxiety. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, planting his hands firmly on his hips. I have been practicing law in this city for 40 years. I have seen every breed of greedy, entitled family attempt to swindle a surviving spouse. I know exactly how Beatrice Sterling operates. She is a shark, and Terrence is the remora swimming beneath her. But you do not just hand over your armor and lie down in the water. You fight. I took a slow, deliberate sip from the porcelain teacup in my hands. The chamomile tea was perfectly steeped, warm, and soothing. I rested the cup on the saucer, keeping my posture impeccably straight. I crossed my legs, smoothing the fabric of my slate-gray pencil skirt. Kenneth, please sit down, I said gently. You are going to wear a hole in your beautiful rug. He did not sit. He marched over to his desk and slammed the folder down. I will not sit down, Nia. Not while you are willingly walking into a slaughterhouse, he insisted, leaning over the desk to look me dead in the eye. Let us talk about the legal reality of your situation. I know you signed that post-nuptial agreement 5 years ago. I know Beatrice bullied you into it. I warned you against it then, but you loved David and you wanted peace. But a post-nuptial agreement is not a titanium vault. It is a piece of paper, and pieces of paper can be contested, litigated, and torn to shreds in a probate court. He began counting on his fingers, his lawyer persona fully activated. First, you have undeniable spousal rights. Regardless of what that document says about Sterling Enterprises, you were married for 5 years. During those 5 years, marital assets were accumulated, joint accounts were funded, real estate appreciated in value. That penthouse you shared with David is not just some Sterling family heirloom. Marital funds were used to maintain it, pay the taxes, and cover the association fees. Under Illinois law, you are entitled to a massive portion of the equity. Second, the valuation of Sterling Enterprises has shifted dramatically during your marriage. You have a legal claim to at least 50% of the marital assets accumulated during this union. I can file an injunction by noon. I can freeze every single account associated with David's estate. I can tie Beatrice and Terrence up in litigation for the next decade. I will not stand here and let those pompous, arrogant snobs walk all over you just because they think you are too grieving to fight back. I listened to his passionate speech without interrupting. I felt a profound wave of gratitude for this man. Kenneth genuinely cared for me. He saw my brilliance when the Sterlings only saw my zip code. He wanted to shield me from the pain of rejection. But he was operating under the assumption that I was acting out of grief, weakness, or intimidation. He thought I was surrendering because I was too heartbroken to endure a battle. He was wrong. I was not broken. I was calculating. Kenneth, I appreciate your fire, I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotional fragility. I really do. You have always been my fiercest advocate, but I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not letting them walk all over me. I am not surrendering because I am afraid of Beatrice. I am not running away because Terrence insulted my intelligence. I'm doing this because it is exactly what needs to be done. Kenneth frowned, shaking his head. He pulled off his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in exasperation. Nia, you are grieving, he said softly, his tone shifting from aggressive lawyer to concerned uncle. David's funeral was yesterday. Your emotions are raw. You are exhausted from putting up a front for those people. People make terrible financial decisions when they are in mourning. You just want them out of your hair. You want the hostility to end. I get that. I truly do. But giving away a multi-million-dollar estate just to buy some peace of mind is not the answer. Big Mama did not raise a quitter. She raised a fighter. If she were sitting in this room right now, she would tell you to put on your boxing gloves and take what is rightfully yours. I smiled at the mention of my grandmother. Big Mama was a fighter, yes. But she was also a master strategist. She used to tell me that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to step out of the ring and let your opponent punch themselves out. Big Mama also taught me never to claim a prize I had not inspected. I countered smoothly. I set my teacup down on the mahogany desk. I am not operating out of grief, Kenneth. I shed my tears for David. I mourned the man I loved. But the man I married is gone, and I am left dealing with a family that views me as a parasite. I have no emotional attachment to the sterling fortune. I never did. I built my own wealth. I built my own company. My peace of mind is not something I am buying, it is something I already own. Kenneth stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He could see the absolute clarity in my eyes. He could see that my hands were not trembling. I was not acting like a traumatized widow making a rash decision. I was acting like a CEO executing a hostile takeover by way of total surrender. Then why, Nia? Kenneth asked, leaning back in his leather chair, clearly bewildered. Why walk away from millions of dollars? Why let Beatrice Sterling win? She is going to parade around Chicago, bragging about how she forced you into the streets. Vanessa will throw parties in your penthouse. Terrence will sit in David's office and pretend he is a titan of industry. Why give them the satisfaction? Because Kenneth's satisfaction is a very fleeting emotion, I replied, my voice dropping to a cool, razor-sharp pitch. And right now, their greed has made them incredibly stupid. They are so obsessed with keeping the Sterling legacy away from me that they are not looking at what the legacy actually is. They want the crown, Kenneth. I am simply stepping aside so they can put it on. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of his desk. I locked eyes with him, projecting all the commanding authority I possessed. Here is what we are going to do. I instructed, outlining my strategy with absolute precision. I want you to draft the surrender documents exactly as Beatrice requested. I want a full, irrevocable transfer of all my spousal rights to David's estate. I want to waive my right to contest the post-nuptial agreement. I want to formally surrender all claims to the penthouse, the cars, the investment portfolios, and every single share of Sterling Enterprises. I want the language to be airtight. I want it to read like a complete and total capitulation. Kenneth opened his mouth to object, but I held up a hand, silencing him instantly. However, I continued, my voice tightening with fierce authority. You must ensure one specific non-negotiable clause is included in those transfer papers. It needs to be heavily highlighted. It needs to be explicit. And it must be signed, initialed, and legally acknowledged by both Terrence and Beatrice Sterling. Kenneth pulled a legal pad toward him, clicking his silver pen. The seasoned lawyer in him was waking up to the fact that I was laying a trap. His posture straightened. I am listening, he said, his pen hovering over the paper. The clause must read exactly like this. I dictated, emphasizing every single syllable. The inheritors assume absolute and unconditional responsibility for all assets and all accompanying liabilities, debts, and federal obligations. Kenneth stopped writing. He slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The frantic pacing energy was completely gone. The room was suddenly so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 14 floors below. He looked at the words he had just written on his legal pad. He read them again. All accompanying liabilities, debts, and federal obligations. Kenneth repeated slowly, rolling the words around in his mouth. He was a brilliant attorney. It did not take him long to see the architecture of my plan. The post-nuptial agreement Beatrice had bullied me into signing 5 years ago was a two-way street. It isolated my assets from David's, meaning whatever I built was mine. But it also meant that whatever David built or destroyed belonged entirely to the Sterling estate. Beatrice had forced that agreement to protect her family's wealth from me. But she had never considered that she might actually be protecting me from her family's ruin. Kenneth slowly placed his pen down on the desk. He looked at me, a profound shift occurring in his demeanor. The protective, anxious father figure was gone. The sharp, ruthless litigator had arrived. Nia, Kenneth said, his voice barely above a whisper. Exactly what is going on with Sterling Enterprises? What do you know that they do not? I reached into my designer handbag. I bypassed my wallet, my keys, and my lip gloss. My fingers closed around a thick, encrypted flash drive. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the center of his mahogany desk. It was the digital key to Exhibit B, the key that would unlock the truth about my late husband, his fraudulent empire, and the magnificent, inescapable trap I had just set for my in-laws. I smiled at my attorney, feeling the full weight of my own power. Let me tell you a story about the Sterling legacy, Kenneth said softly, and then we are going to finalize their inheritance. He was wrong. I was not broken. I was calculating. Kenneth, I appreciate your fire, I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotional fragility. I really do. You have always been my fiercest advocate. But I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not letting them walk all over me. I am not surrendering because I am afraid of Beatrice. I am not running away because Terrence insulted my intelligence. I am doing this because it is exactly what needs to be done. Kenneth frowned, shaking his head. He pulled off his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in exasperation. Nia, you are grieving, he said softly, his tone shifting from aggressive lawyer to concerned uncle. David's funeral was yesterday. Your emotions are raw. You are exhausted from putting up a front for those people. People make terrible financial decisions when they are in mourning. You just want them out of your hair. You want the hostility to end. I get that. I truly do. But giving away a multi-million-dollar estate just to buy some peace of mind is not the answer. Big Mama did not raise a quitter. She raised a fighter. If she were sitting in this room right now, she would tell you to put on your boxing gloves and take what is rightfully yours. I smiled at the mention of my grandmother. Big Mama was a fighter, yes, but she was also a master strategist. She used to tell me that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to step out of the ring and let your opponent punch themselves out. Big Mama also taught me never to claim a prize I had not inspected, I countered smoothly. I set my teacup down on the mahogany desk. I am not operating out of grief, Kenneth. I shed my tears for David. I mourned the man I loved. But the man I married is gone, and I am left dealing with a family that views me as a parasite. I have no emotional attachment to the Sterling fortune. I never did. I built my own wealth. I built my own company. My peace of mind is not something I am buying. It is something I already own. Kenneth stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He could see the absolute clarity in my eyes. He could see that my hands were not trembling. I was not acting like a traumatized widow making a rash decision. I was acting like a CEO executing a hostile takeover by way of total surrender. Then why, Nia? Kenneth asked, leaning back in his leather chair, clearly bewildered. Why walk away from millions of dollars? Why let Beatrice Sterling win? She is going to parade around Chicago bragging about how she forced you into the streets. Vanessa will throw parties in your penthouse. Terrence will sit in David's office and pretend he is a titan of industry. Why give them the satisfaction? Because, Kenneth, satisfaction is a very fleeting emotion, I replied, my voice dropping to a cool, razor-sharp pitch. And right now, their greed has made them incredibly stupid. They are so obsessed with keeping the Sterling legacy away from me that they are not looking at what the legacy actually is. They want the crown, Kenneth. I am simply stepping aside so they can put it on. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of his desk. I locked eyes with him, projecting all the commanding authority I possessed. Here is what we are going to do, I instructed, outlining my strategy with absolute precision. I want you to draft the surrender documents exactly as Beatrice requested. I want a full, irrevocable transfer of all my spousal rights to David's estate. I want to waive my right to contest the postnuptial agreement. I want to formally surrender all claims to the penthouse, the cars, the investment portfolios, and every single share of Sterling Enterprises. I want the language to be airtight. I want it to read like a complete and total capitulation. Kenneth opened his mouth to object, but I held up a hand, silencing him instantly. However, I continued, my voice tightening with fierce authority. You must ensure one specific non-negotiable clause is included in those transfer papers. It needs to be heavily highlighted. It needs to be explicit. And it must be signed, initialed, and legally acknowledged by both Terence and Beatrice Sterling. Kenneth pulled a legal pad toward him, clicking his silver pen. The seasoned lawyer in him was waking up to the fact that I was laying a trap. His posture straightened. I am listening, he said, his pen hovering over the paper. The clause must read exactly like this, I dictated, emphasizing every single syllable. The inheritors assume absolute and unconditional responsibility for all assets and all accompanying liabilities, debts, and federal obligations. Kenneth stopped writing. He slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The frantic pacing energy was completely gone. The room was suddenly so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 14 floors below. He looked at the words he had just written on his legal pad. He read them again. All accompanying liabilities, debts, and federal obligations. Kenneth repeated slowly, rolling the words around in his mouth. He was a brilliant attorney. It did not take him long to see the architecture of my plan. The post-nuptial agreement Beatrice had bullied me into signing 5 years ago was a two-way street. It isolated my assets from David's, meaning whatever I built was mine. But it also meant that whatever David built or destroyed belonged entirely to the Sterling estate. Beatrice had forced that agreement to protect her family's wealth from me, but she had never considered that she might actually be protecting me from her family's ruin. Kenneth slowly placed his pen down on the desk. He looked at me, a profound shift occurring in his demeanor. The protective, anxious father figure was gone. The sharp, ruthless litigator had arrived. Nia, Kenneth said, his voice barely above a whisper, exactly what is going on with Sterling Enterprises. What do you know that they do not? I reached into my designer handbag. I bypassed my wallet, my keys, and my lip gloss. My fingers closed around a thick, encrypted flash drive. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the center of his mahogany desk. It was the digital key to Exhibit B. The key that would unlock the truth about my late husband, his fraudulent empire, and the magnificent, inescapable trap I had just set for my in-laws. I smiled at my attorney, feeling the full weight of my own power. Let me tell you a story about the Sterling legacy, Kenneth said softly, and then we are going to finalize their inheritance. Kenneth reached across the desk, picking up the small encrypted flash drive I had just placed in front of him. He held it between his fingers for a long moment, his eyes darting from the silver metal casing to my face. The heavy silence in his office felt completely different now. The frantic protective energy that had fueled his pacing only moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp analytical focus of a veteran attorney sensing a massive shift in the legal landscape. He plugged the drive into his laptop. A password prompt appeared on his massive monitor. I recited a string of 16 characters from memory. Kenneth typed them in. The screen blinked and a single folder appeared on his desktop. It was labeled simply Exhibit B. He double-clicked the folder. A cascading grid of PDF documents, bank statements, and scanned financial ledgers flooded the screen. Kenneth leaned in, adjusting his reading glasses. He opened the first document, which was a summary of the current operating capital for Sterling Enterprises. I watched his eyes scan the lines of data. I saw the exact second his brain processed the numbers. His brow furrowed. He clicked out of that document and opened another. Then another. He was looking for the billions. He was looking for the vast, untouchable fortune that Beatrice and Terence had spent the entire morning boasting about. There is nothing here, Kenneth whispered, his voice sounding hollow in the cavernous office. Nia, these accounts are empty. The operating capital is non-existent. This cannot be the master ledger. David was managing billions in client portfolios. Where are the secondary holding accounts? Where are the offshore assets Beatrice is always bragging about at charity dinners? There are no secondary accounts, Kenneth, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. There are no offshore assets. There is no billion-dollar empire. It was all smoke and mirrors. Sterling Enterprises is a hollow shell. David was not the brilliant financial titan his family thought he was. He was a fraud. The entire company is nothing but a glorified Ponzi scheme built on massive, compounding deception. Kenneth froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his mouth slightly open. The weight of my words seemed to crush the air out of the room. The Sterling family name was practically royalty in Chicago. They were synonymous with generational wealth and untouchable prestige. To hear that their crown jewel was a criminal enterprise was unfathomable. A Ponzi scheme. Kenneth repeated, testing the words as if they were a foreign language. How is that even possible? David had auditors. He had board members. He had enablers, I corrected sharply. He had a family so obsessed with maintaining their elite image that they never once questioned where the money was actually coming from. Beatrice and Terrence were too busy spending the profits on custom cars and designer clothes to ever ask for a quarterly report. David used new investor money to pay off the old investors. He falsified the returns. He created dummy corporations to hide the bleeding. He kept the machine running just long enough to maintain the illusion of absolute success. But the machine ran out of fuel 6 months ago. I stood up from my chair and walked around to Kenneth's side of the desk. I pointed at the screen, tapping my manicured fingernail against a specific subfolder labeled Federal. Open that one, I instructed. Kenneth clicked on the folder. Dozens of highly classified documents populated the screen. They bore the official seals of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. I watched the color rapidly drain from Kenneth's face. His dark skin went ashen as he began to read the heavily redacted text of a federal subpoena. It gets worse, I told him, my voice completely steady, despite the terrifying reality displayed on the monitor. David knew the Ponzi scheme was collapsing. He knew his investors were going to demand audits that he could not pass. In a desperate attempt to keep Sterling Enterprises afloat and keep Beatrice dripping in diamonds, he began leveraging every single asset attached to his name. He secretly took out massive loans against the company. He drained the family trust funds. He even leveraged the penthouse, that beautiful sprawling estate that Beatrice just kicked me out of. It does not belong to the Sterlings anymore. It belongs to the bank, and they are preparing to foreclose by next week. Kenneth was gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles were turning pale. He scrolled frantically through the DOJ documents. Nia, these are federal indictments. This is not just civil litigation for bad investments. These are criminal charges. I nodded, crossing my arms over my chest. David crossed a line he could never uncross. He stopped stealing from wealthy private investors and started stealing from the government. He falsified applications and embezzled $40 million from federal development grants. The FBI has been building a case against him for the last 14 months. They had an informant inside his accounting department. The Department of Justice was preparing to arrest him. Kenneth ripped his glasses off his face, staring at the screen in absolute horror. $40 million in federal debt, he breathed out. The FBI. The DOJ. Nia, if David had not suffered that heart attack, he would have been arrested before the end of the month. He would have spent the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. Yes, he would have, I said calmly. He died right before the walls caved in. He escaped the consequences of his actions. But those consequences did not just disappear into the grave with him. The federal government still wants their $40 million. The defrauded investors still want their life savings back. The banks still want the money he borrowed against the penthouse and the company vehicles. Kenneth suddenly stood up his chair, rolling violently backward and slamming into the glass window behind him. Panic flared in his eyes. He grabbed my shoulders, his hands shaking. Nia, you were his wife, Kenneth said, his voice rising in terror. If the federal government is coming to collect a $40 million debt, they are going to come after the surviving spouse. The marital estate is going to be seized. They are going to audit your software company. They are going to freeze your personal accounts. We need to get you an impenetrable criminal defense team immediately. You could be implicated in this. You could be facing federal conspiracy charges just by being married to the man. I gently reached up and removed Kenneth's hands from my shoulders. I took a step back and looked at him with a serene, unbothered expression. I am not facing any federal charges, Kenneth, I said softly. And the government cannot touch a single dime of my money. They cannot audit my software company. They cannot seize my personal accounts. My business and my personal assets are completely and entirely firewalled from Sterling Enterprises. Kenneth stared at me, his chest heaving as he tried to process my absolute lack of panic. How can you possibly be shielded from a $40 million federal embezzlement case involving your own husband? I walked back to my chair, smoothed my skirt, and sat down. I picked up my teacup, taking another slow, calming sip before answering him. Because of Beatrice Sterling, I replied, a dark, victorious satisfaction bleeding into my voice. Because 5 years ago, my mother-in-law decided that I was a poor, uneducated liability from the South Side who was going to ruin her precious family legacy. Because she hated me so much that she marched into our home and demanded I sign a post-nuptial agreement. Kenneth stopped breathing. He stood completely frozen behind his desk. Do you remember the terms of that agreement, Kenneth? I asked, leaning back in the chair. You reviewed it for me. You begged me not to sign it because it was so aggressive. Beatrice had her corporate lawyers draft a document that explicitly severed all my financial ties to the Sterling family. She demanded language stating that I would have absolutely zero claim to Sterling Enterprises, zero access to David's investments, and zero liability for the company's financial operations. She insisted on a clause that declared my software business, which she thought was a worthless typing hobby, would remain entirely mine, completely isolated from David's estate. I set the teacup down on the saucer with a sharp clink. She wanted to make sure that if my little business failed, David would not be held responsible for my debts. I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet room. She wanted to isolate me. She wanted to ensure I could never touch their money. And by doing so, she inadvertently ensured that the federal government could never touch mine. Her own malice, her own bigotry, and her own desperate need to protect her precious legacy completely saved me from federal prison. Kenneth slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair. He stared at me as the full, brilliant reality of the situation washed over him. The post-nuptial agreement proves you had no legal or financial involvement in Sterling Enterprises. Kenneth whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and awe. It proves you had no access to the stolen federal funds. It is an ironclad shield. Beatrice handed you the ultimate legal alibi. Exactly, I said, smiling at him. That piece of paper she used to bully me is the only reason I am not sitting in an FBI interrogation room right now. Kenneth turned his attention back to the laptop screen. He opened the file containing the final draft of the DOJ indictment. He read the summary outlining the catastrophic $40 million debt, the impending asset seizures, and the criminal conspiracy charges. The color that had drained from his face slowly began to return. He looked at the indictment. Then he looked at the notes he had just scribbled on his legal pad. The notes detailing the exact transfer documents I had instructed him to draft. The documents surrendering my rights to the estate. The specific, non-negotiable clause I demanded Beatrice and Terrence sign. The inheritors assume absolute and unconditional responsibility for all assets, and all accompanying liabilities, debts, and federal obligations. Kenneth read the clause out loud. His voice cracked. He looked at me, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He finally understood why I had walked away from the penthouse without a fight. He understood why I had smiled when Terrence demanded the keys to the company cars. He understood exactly what I was handing over to my greedy, arrogant in-laws. You are not giving them a billion-dollar empire, Kenneth said, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. The anxiety and fear were completely eradicated, replaced by a fierce, triumphant gleam. You are giving them a $40 million federal crime. They demanded the Sterling legacy, I replied, standing up from the chair and smoothing my jacket. They insulted my grandmother, they insulted my intelligence, and they declared that the company belongs to blood Sterlings. I am simply respecting their wishes. I am giving them everything David left behind, every single cent of his debt, every single impending foreclosure, and the direct, undivided attention of the Department of Justice. Kenneth began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle in his chest and grew into a booming, joyous sound that filled the entire office. He slapped his hand down on the mahogany desk, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "They are going to sign it." Kenneth laughed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "They are so arrogant, so blinded by their own greed and their hatred for you, that they are going to sign that document without bringing in their own auditors. Terrence wants to be CEO so badly, he will run right off the cliff to get to the chair. Terrence is going to sign his name as the sole managing director and chief executive officer of a federally investigated Ponzi scheme." I confirmed my voice, carrying the quiet, undeniable power of absolute karma. "And Beatrice is going to sign as the primary beneficiary of a $40 million debt." Kenneth quickly turned back to his keyboard. His fingers began flying across the keys with renewed frantic energy. He was no longer trying to protect me from making a mistake. He was racing to construct the perfect trap. "I will draft the transfer documents immediately," Kenneth said, his eyes glued to the screen. "I will bury Exhibit B, the FBI notices, the debt ledgers, and the DOJ indictment drafts at the very bottom of the legal stack. I will camouflage it with so much standard probate jargon that Attorney Davis will not even bother to read the fine print. Make sure Terrence's title is prominent," I instructed, walking toward the office door. "Stroke his ego. Make the CEO title bold. He will not be able to resist signing it the second he sees his name in print." Kenneth nodded enthusiastically, already completely absorbed in drafting the legal snare. "Consider it done, Madam CEO. The Sterling family is about to inherit exactly what they deserve." I opened the heavy oak door, stepping out into the bustling hallway of the law firm. I felt lighter than I had in years. The suffocating weight of the Sterling family's judgment was gone. I was no longer the grieving widow trapped in a hostile penthouse. I was the architect of their destruction, and the blueprint was flawless. I paused with my hand lingering on the brass handle of the heavy oak door. The bustling hallway of the law firm stretched out before me, offering an immediate escape into the crisp Chicago afternoon. Yet the sound of Kenneth's fingers pausing over his keyboard drew my attention back into his spacious office. I turned around to see him staring at me over the rim of his reading glasses. The frantic energy of his drafting had momentarily subsided, replaced by a deep, searching curiosity. The glowing screen of his laptop illuminated the quiet awe settling across his features. "Nia," Kenneth said, his voice dropping its formal, litigious edge. "Before you go, I need to ask you something. Something that has been bothering me since you dropped that flash drive on my desk." I released the door handle and walked slowly back toward the center of the room. I leaned against the back of the leather guest chair, crossing my arms and giving him my full attention. "Ask me anything, Kenneth." He gestured toward the digital files still open on his monitor. "I understand how the post-nuptial agreement shielded you from David's criminal liability. I understand how the federal government cannot touch your personal accounts. But David was drowning in a $40 million deficit. He had leveraged the penthouse, drained the family trust, and was running a fraudulent empire on fumes. His accounts have been functionally empty for months." Kenneth leaned back, folding his hands together. "How did you survive? How did you pay for your life, your clothes, your business expenses? If David was completely bankrupting his own company and secretly drowning in federal debt, how did you manage to stay financially afloat without noticing the absolute lack of capital coming from your husband?" I smiled, a soft, genuine expression that reached my eyes. It was a question born of Kenneth's protective nature, but it also highlighted the very blind spot that had doomed the Sterling family. I walked around the chair and took my seat again, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. "That is the beauty of their arrogance, Kenneth." I explained, my voice steady and clear. "David never paid for my life. He never funded my business. He never paid for the clothes on my back or the laptops I use. The Sterlings assumed he did because they cannot fathom a world where a woman from the South Side does not need their money. They assumed I was a parasite draining his resources, and David was too proud to correct them. He liked the illusion of being my provider. He liked letting Beatrice and Vanessa believe he had rescued me from poverty. But the truth is, I stopped relying on David's money the day after we signed that post-nuptial agreement. Kenneth tilted his head, his brow furrowing in concentration. But your business is just a small software startup. That is what David told me when we reviewed the documents 5 years ago. He said it was a passion project, a typing hobby, as Vanessa so eloquently put it this morning. You cannot fund a Gold Coast lifestyle on a passion project. It is not a typing hobby, I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on his mahogany desk. And it is not a small startup anymore. That is what I let them believe because it kept them out of my affairs. My company is an enterprise-level supply chain software platform. We design and implement automated logistics architecture for global shipping conglomerates. Kenneth's eyes widened behind his glasses. He sat completely still, absorbing the magnitude of the revelation. Global shipping conglomerates, Nia, that is a massive industry. That requires serious initial capital. If David did not fund the seed money for an enterprise-level platform, who did? I felt a familiar warmth bloom in my chest at the question. I looked past Kenneth out the window at the sprawling Chicago skyline, but what I saw was the small, impeccably clean brick house on the south side where I grew up. Big Mama did, I answered softly, a fierce pride ringing in every syllable. My grandmother worked as a nurse at Cook County Hospital for 42 years. She worked double shifts. She rode the bus in the freezing cold. She wore the same winter coat for a decade so she could put food on the table and keep a roof over my head. Beatrice Sterling used to mock her. She used to laugh with her high society friends about my working-class grandmother, who wore sensible shoes and scrub uniforms. Beatrice thought Big Mama was nothing but a poor, uneducated laborer. I looked back at Kenneth, my gaze hardening into steel. But Big Mama was smarter than all of them combined. She knew she was not going to leave behind a trust fund or a mansion, but she paid her life insurance premiums every single month without fail. When she passed away, she left me a policy worth exactly $150,000. It was her entire life's work handed to me in a single check. She told me to use it to build my own table so I would never have to beg for a seat at anyone else's. I took that $150,000 and I poured every single cent of it into writing code. I continued the memory of those early exhausting days, fueling my voice. I hired a small team of independent developers. We worked out of a rented windowless office space above a laundromat. We built the logistical architecture from the ground up. I did not buy designer handbags. I did not lease luxury cars. I invested Big Mama's blood, sweat, and tears into building a platform that could revolutionize freight tracking, and we succeeded. Kenneth stared at me, completely speechless. The seasoned attorney, who was rarely caught off guard, was visibly staggered by the scope of what I had kept hidden behind the walls of the Sterling penthouse. Just how successful is this platform, Nia? Kenneth asked, his voice dropping to a hushed, reverent tone. What is the actual valuation of your company? I maintained my absolute composure, delivering the numbers with clinical precision. We closed our Series B funding round last month. My company secured a $25 million valuation. I own 70% of the equity. We operate under a completely independent limited liability corporation. The corporate structure is entirely firewalled. Kenneth let out a sharp, breathless laugh, dragging a hand across his face. $25 million. You have been sitting on a $25 million tech empire, while Beatrice and Vanessa treated you like a charity case. While David was actively defrauding the federal government to keep up appearances, you were quietly building a legitimate fortune. Exactly, I affirmed, my voice ringing with undeniable power. I did not need David's money. I did not need the Sterling name. I had Big Mama's legacy. David and his family never bothered to look into my accounts, I explained, leaning back into the leather chair. They were too busy looking down on me to ever look closely at my tax returns. They saw me working on my laptop at the dining table and assumed I was doing secretarial work. Their arrogance was the ultimate camouflage. Because they believed I was beneath them, they never asked the right questions. They never realized that the woman they dismissed as a Southside gold digger was entirely self-sufficient. Kenneth shook his head slowly, a look of profound respect etching itself into his features. You isolated your empire right under their noses. This is not just about escaping David's debt, Kenneth, I said, my voice hardening with unshakable resolve. This is about protecting Big Mama's legacy. Beatrice and Terrence only value status designer labels and unearned prestige. They are perfectly willing to steal and defraud to maintain their illusion of superiority. I refuse to let the Sterlings drag my clean, hard-earned empire into their criminal mess. I will not let the federal government seize the company I built with my grandmother's sacrifice just to pay off David's fraudulent loans. Big Mama's money built my platform, and I will defend it with my life. Kenneth stopped pacing entirely. He sat down heavily in his executive chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked at the federal indictment draft glowing on his monitor. He looked at the legal transfer documents he had just begun drafting. Then a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. He finally grasped the absolute, poetic justice of the deadly trap I was setting. He realized that my greedy in-laws were not just inheriting a massive federal debt, they were inheriting the ultimate devastating humiliation. Nia Sterling, Kenneth said, picking up his silver pen with renewed aggressive enthusiasm. Let us permanently finalize their miserable inheritance today. I calmly nodded my head in total agreement, completely ready to watch them fall. Kenneth turned back to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard like a concert pianist preparing to play a masterpiece. The room settled into a focused quiet, broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clacking of the keys. I remained seated in the leather guest chair, watching as the architect of the Sterling family's destruction went to work. We had a trap to build, and it required absolute precision. I cleared my throat, maintaining my professional posture. Terrence is a man driven entirely by his own vanity, I said, breaking the silence. He does not care about the operational logistics of Sterling Enterprises. He does not care about the actual balance sheets. He only cares about the title, the prestige, and the power he believes comes with it. We need to frame this document so that all he sees is his own elevation. If he feels like he has conquered David's kingdom, he will sign anything we put in front of him. Kenneth nodded, his eyes never leaving the screen. I am drafting the primary transfer agreement right now. I am filling the first 3 pages with the most flattering, grandiose legal language permitted by the state of Illinois. We will formally designate him with the exact title he is salivating for. Kenneth paused his typing and looked over his glasses. How does sole managing director and chief executive officer of Sterling Enterprises sound? Make it sound even more permanent, I instructed, standing up and walking around the desk to look at the screen. Add, with absolute discretionary control over all corporate assets, subsidiaries, and holding companies. We need him to believe he is gaining unchecked unilateral power. Beatrice will love that language just as much as he will. She wants to know that her son is the undisputed king. When they read that paragraph, their egos will completely shut down their critical thinking skills. Done, Kenneth said, his fingers flying across the keys again. I am placing his new title at the very top of page 1 in bold, capitalized letters. It will be the first thing he sees. He will be so intoxicated by the sight of his own name next to the words Chief Executive Officer that he will skip right past the indemnification clauses. What about Beatrice? I asked, leaning against the edge of the desk. Beatrice gets the estate, Kenneth replied smoothly. I am drafting a separate clause transferring the deed to the penthouse and all personal property directly into her name. I am calling it the matriarchal estate transfer. It is absolute garbage terminology, but it sounds incredibly regal. She will sign it just to officially assert her dominance over the property. The trap was taking shape flawlessly. By focusing entirely on their greed and their desperate need for status, We were blinding them to the reality of the transaction. But the decoy language was only the first part of the strategy. The real weapon lay in the hidden files. "Now for the fun part," Kenneth said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to attach Exhibit B." He opened the encrypted folder I had given him and extracted the heavily redacted Federal Bureau of Investigation, noticed the Department of Justice indictment draft, and the catastrophic $40 million debt ledger. These were the documents that proved David's criminal embezzlement, the imminent foreclosure of the penthouse, and the total bankruptcy of Sterling Enterprises. "We cannot hide these documents completely, or the transfer could be legally contested later," Kenneth explained, dragging the digital files into the master document. "They have to be physically and legally attached to the signature page, but we can bury them so deeply in standard legal boilerplate that Attorney Davis will not even bother to investigate." I watched as Kenneth manipulated the document structure. He took the deadly financial disclosures and buried them under 40 pages of standard corporate liability waivers, environmental compliance forms, and mundane tax disclaimers. "I am nesting Exhibit B inside a section labeled Standard Assumption of Routine Corporate Liabilities and Minor Creditor Obligations," Kenneth said, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "It is a standard clause used in nearly every corporate transfer. No one ever reads it because it usually just means the new owner agrees to pay the utility bills and the outstanding vendor invoices. It is the most boring, tedious section of the entire contract." He linked the $40 million federal debt directly to Terrence's new title as sole managing director. He legally bound the impending FBI asset seizure to Beatrice's new designation as the primary property holder. Every single ounce of David's criminal fallout was now tied inextricably to their signatures. "Let us make sure Attorney Davis has absolutely no reason to raise a red flag," Kenneth said, opening a new window on his computer. "Davis is lazy. He relies on his junior associates to read the boilerplate, and junior associates only look for specific trigger words. I am stripping out any explicit mention of the word embezzlement in the visible headers. I am replacing it with federal grant reallocation discrepancies. It means the exact same thing in a court of law, but it sounds like a minor accounting error instead of a federal felony." "Brilliant," I noted. "What about the impending foreclosure on the penthouse? Beatrice will want to see the property deed listed cleanly." "I am listing the property deed with a clean transfer of title," Kenneth explained. "But I am adding a subsection that binds the title transfer to the existing and outstanding corporate leverage agreements. It essentially says that by accepting the deed to the penthouse, she is also accepting the collateral debt attached to it. When the bank comes to foreclose, they will not be looking for David's estate. They will be looking directly at Beatrice. When they sign this," Kenneth said, printing the massive document, "they are legally acknowledging that they have reviewed and accepted the terms of Exhibit B. They are stating on the public record that they understand the company is under federal investigation and that they willingly accept the $40 million financial penalty. They are signing their own financial death warrants." The printer in the corner of the office whirred to life, spitting out page after page of the deadly contract. I walked over and picked up the thick stack of paper. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the consequences of David's crimes and Beatrice's cruelty. I flipped to the very bottom of the stack. There, perfectly camouflaged amid walls of dense, impenetrable legal jargon, was the DOJ indictment notice. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet concentration in the office. I pulled the phone from my handbag and looked at the caller ID. The name Beatrice Sterling flashed across the screen. Kenneth stopped organizing the papers and looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "Speak of the devil. Do you want me to answer it and tell her the documents are ready?" "No," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I will handle this. We need to keep her comfortable. We need to keep her feeling victorious." I cleared my throat, forcing my posture to slump slightly physically, preparing my body to play the role of the defeated, broken widow. I took a deep breath, banished all trace of the confident CEO I truly was, and answered the call. "Hello, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice soft, hesitant, and laced with a carefully manufactured exhaustion. "Nia," Beatrice's voice came through the speaker, dripping with condescension and arrogant authority. I am calling to confirm your departure timeline. I have already contacted the interior decorators. They are arriving at the penthouse on Thursday morning to begin measuring for the renovations. I expect you and your belongings to be entirely vacated before they arrive. She was not even giving me a week. She wanted me out immediately, eager to scrub my existence from the property. I understand, Beatrice, I replied, allowing my voice to tremble just a fraction of an inch. I have already started packing my things. I will be out of the penthouse by Wednesday evening. You will not have to see me. Excellent, Beatrice said, clearly pleased by my rapid submission. And the transfer documents, Terrence has been asking about them all morning. He is eager to take the helm of the company and fix whatever mess you and your little typing hobby might have caused. He has a real vision for Sterling Enterprises. I looked across the desk at Kenneth. He was biting his knuckle, silently laughing at the sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from the phone. I am at Kenneth Wright's office right now, I said, projecting a tone of utter resignation. We are finalizing the paperwork exactly as you demanded. I am surrendering everything, Beatrice. I am signing away my spousal rights, the penthouse, the investment accounts, and the company. You have won. A long, deeply satisfied sigh echoed through the phone. I could practically hear Beatrice smiling. I could picture her standing in the foyer of her own mansion, adjusting her pearls, reveling in the glorious triumph of destroying a woman she deemed unworthy of her family name. It is not about winning, Nia, Beatrice lied smoothly, her tone adopting a fake maternal sweetness that made my skin crawl. It is about protecting the Sterling bloodline. It is about ensuring that David's legacy remains in the hands of people who truly understand wealth and responsibility. You were always out of your depth in our world. You are a hard-working girl, I will give you that. But you never had the refinement or the intellect to manage an empire. This is for the best. You can go back to your simple life, and we can restore the prestige of this family. You are right, I agreed, feeding her ego with a silver spoon. I could never manage David's empire. The sheer magnitude of his financial obligations is completely beyond my understanding. Terrence is the only one equipped to handle the reality of Sterling Enterprises. The company belongs with him. I am glad you have finally accepted your reality, Beatrice purred. Have your attorney send the documents to Attorney Davis by 5 o'clock today. We will review them, and Terrence and I will sign them tomorrow morning. Clean break, Nia. Clean break. A very clean break, I echoed softly. Goodbye, Beatrice. I pressed the end call button and tossed the phone onto Kenneth's desk. I dropped the act instantly. My spine straightened, the faux exhaustion vanishing from my face, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. Kenneth was shaking his head, a look of profound respect directed at me. You are terrifying, he said, tapping his pen against the legal pad. You just handed her the grenade, pulled the pin, and convinced her it was a diamond. She thinks she has outsmarted me, I said, picking up the thick stack of transfer documents. She thinks she is protecting her bloodline. By tomorrow morning, she and Terrence will sign these papers. They will officially claim ownership of a $40 million federal debt. They will assume absolute responsibility for a criminal Ponzi scheme, and they will invite the wrath of the Department of Justice directly onto their own heads. I looked out the window at the city below. The cars looked like tiny ants moving along the grid. The people down there were living their lives completely unaware of the financial earthquake that was about to strike the Gold Coast. David spent 5 years making me feel like I was lucky to be in his presence. I said, my voice quiet but hard. He let Beatrice treat me like a maid. He let Terrence treat me like an idiot. And all the while he was using their arrogance as a shield for his crimes. He knew they would never look at the books because they were too busy looking at themselves. Kenneth stood up, grabbing the finalized folder. And now that same arrogance is going to be their prison. He handed me the folder. The trap is set, Nia. The bait is polished, the decoy is perfect, and Exhibit B is buried so deep they will need a backhoe to find it. I will courier this directly to Attorney Davis's office. I took the folder, feeling the physical weight of my freedom in my hands. The Sterling family was about to face the reality of the legacy they worshipped so fiercely. Send it, I commanded. Let them sign their own ruin. The quiet ride back to the penthouse felt exactly like a long victory lap. I watched the city blur past the dark-tinted windows, feeling a profound sense of detachment. When I walked through the heavy mahogany doors for the final time, the silence no longer felt like a heavy burden. I did not mourn the marble floors or crystal chandeliers. I walked into the master suite, pulled my duffel from the closet, and began packing. I had promised Beatrice I would be gone by Wednesday evening, but she wanted the gratification of seeing me displaced early. My prediction proved correct 2 hours later. I was wrapping my hard drives when the front door chimed, followed by a key turning in the lock. Beatrice simply let herself in, asserting her reclaimed dominance. I heard the clicking of her heels echoing across the foyer, accompanied by the frantic tapping of Vanessa's stilettos. A chorus of voices drifted down the hallway. I did not stop packing. I did not rush. I simply folded my sweaters with precision. Beatrice appeared in the doorway, leaning against the doorframe with the arrogant posture of a conquering queen surveying her captured territory. She wore a crimson suit that clashed with the neutral bedroom. Vanessa stood behind her, flanked by a man holding a tablet and a fabric swatch book. We decided to come early to supervise the transition, Beatrice announced. We need to ensure none of the Sterling family heirlooms find their way into your bags. I have an inventory list and I will check it against what you take. I did not dignify the insult with a response. I zipped my duffel and moved to my jewelry box. I bypassed the diamonds David had bought me and reached for the gold cross necklace Big Mama had given me. I placed it gently into a velvet pouch. Vanessa pushed past her mother, dragging the interior designer into the center of the room. She swept her arm in a wide arc, gesturing to the minimalist decor I had spent months perfecting. "Julian, look at this disaster," Vanessa shrieked, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. "It is entirely too sterile. It looks like a cheap hotel. We are going to have to gut this entire floor. I want this tacky, low-class aesthetic eradicated by the weekend. Rip up this carpeting, tear down these sconces, and let us bring back the warm traditionalism that reflects our family's standing." The designer Julian nodded enthusiastically, tapping rapidly on his screen. "Absolutely, Vanessa. We can strip this down to the studs. It lacks heritage. It lacks refinement. It lacks the sterling touch," Beatrice agreed, eyeing me with predatory satisfaction. "But we will cleanse the palette soon enough. It is amazing how quickly you can erase a mistake with the right budget." I continued packing, ignoring their attempts to provoke a reaction. I moved to my nightstand, grabbing my chargers and cables. The heavy silence I maintained seemed to suck the oxygen out of their performance. Just then, the front door slammed shut, and Terrence's booming voice filled the penthouse. He strode down the hallway, laughing loudly into his cell phone. He did not even pause to acknowledge me as he entered the master suite, treating me as if I were already a ghost. "I am telling you, the ink is basically dry," Terrence bragged, his chest puffed out in masculine triumph. "The transfer documents are sitting on the lawyer's desk right now. By tomorrow morning, I am the sole managing director and chief executive officer. Yeah, the whole empire. Listen, call the dealership right now. I am putting in the order for the new fleet. I want the Aston Martin, the Porsche, and the Range Rover. Put them directly under the Sterling Enterprises corporate account. No, do not worry about the budget. The company is paying for it all." Terrence ended the call, shoving the phone into his pocket. He looked around the room, grinning at his mother and sister, before his eyes finally landed on me. "Make sure you pack light," Nia Terrence sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You are not going to have much room for storage in whatever shoebox apartment you are moving into. And leave the keys to the Audi on the counter. The corporate perks are officially revoked." I looked at him, completely unbothered. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the sleek silver key fob, and tossed it casually onto the mattress. It landed with a soft thud. Terrence scoffed, snatching it up like a trophy. I turned back to my packing. I gathered my 3 high-performance laptops, securing them in my reinforced carrying case. These machines contained the source code for my $25 million logistics platform. They were the only true assets in this room. Everything else was just expensive leveraged debris. Finally, I walked over to the dresser and picked up the small framed photograph of Big Mama. She was smiling in her nursing scrubs, looking tired but fiercely proud. I wiped the glass and placed it carefully into my personal tote bag. Vanessa was practically vibrating with frustration. She had come here expecting a show. She wanted tears. She wanted me to beg. She wanted to see me broken, sobbing over the loss of a billionaire lifestyle she assumed I worshipped. My absolute icy stoicism was driving her insane. "Are you seriously just going to leave like a coward?" Vanessa snapped, stepping closer, her voice shrill and demanding. "You fought tooth and nail to manipulate my brother into marrying you, and now you are just slinking away without a word. You are pathetic. You know you are nothing without him. You know you are going right back to the gutter where you belong. Cry, Nia. Show some actual emotion for once in your miserable life." I zipped my tote bag shut. I slipped the strap over my shoulder and grabbed the handle of my rolling duffel. I turned to face Vanessa, my expression completely blank. I looked at Beatrice, who was watching me with narrow, calculating eyes, and then at Terence, who was tossing the car keys in the air and catching them with arrogant ease. I began my walk toward the bedroom door. They parted to let me through, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous energy radiating from my calm demeanor. I walked down the long hallway, the wheels of my luggage gliding over the imported marble. They followed me, stalking behind me like predators, ensuring their prey actually exited the territory. When I reached the grand entryway, I placed my hand on the brass doorknob. I stopped. I did not open the door immediately. Instead, I turned around to face the three of them. They stood in a unified line, the undisputed victors of a war they did not understand they were fighting. I looked at Beatrice, whose chin was raised in snobbish, aristocratic defiance. I looked at Vanessa, who was glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. And I looked at Terence, who was already mentally spending money that did not exist. "I owe David a great deal," I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant cadence that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "He taught me exactly what this family values." I paused, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I gave them one last chance, one final fleeting opportunity at redemption. "Are you absolutely sure you want everything David left behind?" I asked, my gaze locking onto Terrence's smug face. "Absolutely every single asset, every single obligation. Because taking the throne is easy, but sometimes heavy crowns break weak necks." Terrence let out a loud, barking laugh that bounced off the walls. He shook his head, looking at me as if I were a delusional peasant trying to offer advice to a king. "You are so dramatic," Nia, Terrence mocked, taking a step forward and pointing toward the door. "We want every single thing my brother built. We want his entire legacy. We are Sterlings. We do not break. Now get out of our house. Get out of our company, and do not ever let me see your face in this city again." Beatrice nodded in arrogant agreement, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "You heard the CEO, Nia. Goodbye." I held Terrence's gaze for one final second. I saw the absolute, unwavering certainty in his eyes. I saw the unyielding greed that was about to pull him directly into a federal nightmare. They had stubbornly rejected my warning. They had blindly demanded their destruction. My conscience was completely, permanently clear. "Enjoy the heavy crown, Terrence," I whispered. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. I pulled it shut, the heavy click sealing the Sterlings inside their $40 million tomb. I walked to the elevator, pulling my luggage, and pressed the button. I had a company to run, and they had a very busy morning ahead. The elevator descent felt like shedding a physical weight. The polished brass walls reflected a woman who had successfully executed the most dangerous maneuver of her career. I watched the numbers tick down, descending from the isolated arrogance of the penthouse to the reality of the parking garage. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the concrete expanse. The air was damp, smelling of motor oil. It was a stark contrast to the atmosphere of Beatrice's domain. I gripped the handles of my duffel and laptop case, the wheels echoing across the pavement. My footsteps were steady, driven by the certainty of my victory. I navigated through the rows of luxury vehicles heading toward the loading zone, anticipating a quiet exit. But the Sterling family possessed an ability to ruin a peaceful moment. The sharp clacking of stiletto heels broke the silence. I did not need to turn around to know who was stalking me. Vanessa stepped from behind a pillar blocking the pathway to the exit doors. She had rushed down the service elevator desperate to intercept me. Her chest was heaving, her hands clenched into fists. She wore a tailored coat draped over her shoulders, an outfit meant to project power, but her eyes betrayed a frantic need for validation. Vanessa could not stand how I had walked out of that penthouse. My refusal to break down had robbed her of the emotional climax she deserved. She needed me to suffer to validate her inflated sense of superiority. I stopped walking, leaving 6 feet of space between us. I did not speak. I simply looked at her, my expression a blank mask. My silence was a weapon, and it was working. Vanessa shifted her weight, unnerved by my lack of reaction, but her spite quickly overpowered her hesitation. She reached into her handbag, her movements sharp and erratic. "You really think you are walking out of here with your dignity intact?" Vanessa sneered, her voice echoing harshly in the cold garage. "You think keeping your mouth shut makes you look strong. It just makes you look exactly like what you are. A pathetic gold-digging failure who got thrown out with the trash." She pulled a slim checkbook from her bag, snapped it open, withdrew a gold pen, and began scribbling aggressively. She tore the check from the binding with a violent jerk. "You came to this family with nothing, and you are leaving with nothing," Vanessa stated, stepping closer. "But my mother and I had a brief discussion. We have a reputation to uphold. The Sterlings are philanthropists. We donate to charities. We sponsor shelters. We certainly do not want the high society blogs whispering that we left David's widow starving on the streets. It would be a terrible look for Terrence's first week as chief executive officer." Vanessa held the check between her fingers. I could clearly see the amount written in bold ink. $10,000. A sum she likely spent on a single handbag offered to me as a severance package. "Take it," Vanessa demanded, throwing the check directly at my feet. It fluttered through the damp air and landed face up on the cold concrete. "Buy yourself a little apartment in the hood. Get a bus pass. Stock up on whatever cheap food you people eat. Just take the money and disappear so we never have to think about your existence again." I looked down at the rectangular piece of paper resting against my leather boot. I did not move a single muscle. I did not widen my eyes. I did not frown. I simply stared at the check, then slowly raised my gaze to meet Vanessa's expectant eyes. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for me to bend down to humble myself to pick up her scrap of charity. She wanted to watch me break my posture and concede defeat. I held her gaze for 10 agonizing seconds. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then with deliberate grace, I stepped forward. I did not kick the check. I did not step on it. I simply lifted my foot and stepped directly over it, completely ignoring its existence. I pulled my duffel behind me, the wheels rolling smoothly past the $10,000 insult. Vanessa gasped, a sharp intake of breath fueled by pure outrage. "You ungrateful, arrogant little—" She began to shout, pivoting on her heels to face my back. But her words were abruptly cut off by a sound that commanded absolute attention. A deep, resonant purr echoed through the subterranean garage. It was the sound of a massive, meticulously engineered engine approaching. A vehicle turned the corner and glided down the center aisle, its headlights cutting through the dim lighting. It was not an Uber. It was not a standard town car. It was a brand-new custom-ordered Obsidian black Mercedes Maybach. The vehicle was a masterclass in understated, terrifying wealth. It lacked the flashy, obnoxious modifications that Terrence favored. It was sleek, elongated, and hummed with quiet, untouchable power. The tinted windows were completely opaque, giving the vehicle an aura of absolute privacy and dominance. The Maybach glided to a smooth, silent halt directly beside me, completely blocking Vanessa's line of sight to the exit doors. The heavy driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid and highly professional. He moved with clinical efficiency, walking swiftly around the front of the massive vehicle. He did not glance at the luxury cars parked nearby. He did not even register Vanessa's presence standing a few yards away in her bright designer coat. His attention was focused entirely on me. "Good afternoon, Madam CEO." the driver said, his voice carrying a deep, respectful resonance that echoed clearly across the concrete walls. "I trust your transition was handled smoothly. It was executed flawlessly." "Marcus," I replied, offering him a brief, genuine nod. "Allow me to handle your personal effects, Madam CEO." Marcus insisted, stepping forward. He took the handle of my rolling duffel and gently relieved me of my heavy laptop case, treating the equipment with the utmost reverence. He moved to the rear of the Maybach, the trunk opening automatically with a soft mechanical whir, and carefully stowed my belongings. I turned slightly to look at Vanessa. She was frozen in place, her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting frantically between me, the imposing driver, and the $500,000 vehicle idling on the pavement. The $10,000 check lay forgotten on the ground between us, looking increasingly absurd in the shadow of the Maybach. Her perfectly constructed reality was short-circuiting. The narrative she had clung to, the broke, evicted widow scurrying back to poverty, was crumbling before her eyes. How can a broke, evicted widow afford a personal driver and a Maybach? I could see the question screaming behind her panicked eyes. I could see the sudden terrifying seed of doubt taking root in her mind. If I was completely bankrupt, if I was relying on David's empty bank accounts, this scene was a mathematical impossibility. A woman carrying a $25 million tech empire does not need a $10,000 charity check. A woman who commands global logistics platforms does not take the bus. Marcus closed the trunk and moved to the passenger compartment. He opened the heavy rear door of the Maybach, stepping back and holding his arm out in a gesture of absolute deference. I walked toward the open door, my posture immaculate, my expression completely unbothered. I paused for a fraction of a second, casting one final glance over my shoulder at Vanessa. She was standing in the exhaust fumes, surrounded by the cold, concrete walls, clutching her designer bag, as if it could protect her from the confusion spiraling in her brain. Her eyes met mine, searching desperately for an explanation, a sign that this was a rental, a trick, an illusion. But the doubt was quickly overpowered by her inherent toxic greed. I watched her face contort as she forcibly shoved the cognitive dissonance away. She convinced herself right there on the pavement that I was just running another con. She chose to believe her mother's narrative because the alternative, that she and Terrence had blindly inherited a catastrophic federal nightmare, was too terrifying to confront. She chose the fragile, comforting illusion of her own superiority over the cold, undeniable reality. I finally stepped into the luxurious leather-lined interior of the Maybach. Marcus closed the heavy door behind me with a solid, definitive thud, shutting out the cold garage and Vanessa's bewildered face. As the heavy vehicle accelerated smoothly toward the exit ramp, I sank back into the plush, comfortable seating. The legal trap was set, the shiny bait was taken, and the Sterling family was officially standing on the tracks, completely blind to the freight train hurtling in their direction. The heavy oak doors of the Cook County Probate Court swung open 2 weeks later, ushering in the final act of our carefully orchestrated play. The morning air was crisp, but inside the courthouse the atmosphere was stiflingly formal. I stood in the corridor by courtroom 4B, remaining out of sight, observing the grand entrance of the Sterling family. They did not arrive like a grieving family attending a probate hearing. They arrived as if they were stepping onto a red carpet at an exclusive charity gala. Beatrice led the procession, draped in a tailored Chanel suit the color of crushed velvet. A massive diamond brooch rested against her collarbone, catching the harsh fluorescent lights and throwing fractured rainbows across the beige walls. She walked with her chin tilted upward, her posture rigid with an unearned sense of royalty. Terrence walked beside her, wearing a bespoke Italian suit that fit slightly too tight across the shoulders. He was already adopting the physical mannerisms of a corporate titan, adjusting his silk tie and checking the face of a platinum Rolex he had undoubtedly purchased on credit just days prior. Vanessa trailed behind them, her heels clicking loudly against the linoleum. She carried a Birkin bag on her forearm like a shield, her eyes darting around the hallway, seeking an audience to admire her fabricated wealth. They were a walking, talking display of obscene vanity. They were so consumed by their own performance that they completely ignored the solemn nature of the building they had entered. They were here to claim their kingdom, and they wanted every lawyer, clerk, and judge in the vicinity to know it. They treated the bailiffs like personal valets, handing over their coats with dismissive gestures. Beatrice loudly complained about the lack of premium coffee in the waiting area, her voice echoing down the corridor. Terence was busy texting on his phone, likely finalizing the orders for those sports cars he had bragged about in the penthouse. They were completely insulated by their own arrogance. They had spent the last 2 weeks measuring curtains and planning corporate takeovers, thoroughly convinced that my surrender was a testament to their inherent superiority. They never once questioned why I had yielded so easily. They never once asked Attorney Davis to comb through the microscopic details of the transfer documents. Their greed had acted as the perfect anesthetic, numbing any lingering sense of caution or basic legal due diligence. A few moments later, their legal representation arrived. Attorney Richard Davis strutted down the hallway, perfectly matching the toxic energy of his clients. Davis was a smug, fast-talking man who had built a career on bullying opposing counsel and leveraging the Sterling name to intimidate smaller firms. He wore a pinstripe suit and a perpetually condescending smirk. He carried a single, slim leather portfolio, a physical manifestation of his supreme overconfidence. He approached Beatrice and Terence, greeting them with aggressive handshakes and loud, booming laughter that drew irritated glances from the court clerks. "Everything is moving perfectly," Davis announced, his voice booming down the corridor. "I have already spoken with the judge's clerk. We are going to push this through before the morning recess. Wright is a competent local attorney, but he is completely out of his depth dealing with corporate estate transfers of this magnitude. He basically handed us the keys to the castle without a fight." Kenneth Wright stood quietly near the water fountain just a few yards away, sipping from a paper cup. He wore his standard understated navy suit, his demeanor calm and observant. He did not react to the loud, abrasive insults. He simply adjusted his glasses and watched the spectacle unfold. Davis clearly underestimated Kenneth. Davis saw a quiet, methodical lawyer and assumed weakness. He did not realize that Kenneth had spent the last 48 hours reviewing the Federal Bureau of Investigation asset seizure protocols, ensuring that our trap was legally airtight. Davis turned to the bailiff guarding the courtroom doors, leaning in with an air of arrogant entitlement. "We need to expedite this process," Davis demanded, tapping his expensive pen against his leather folder. "My clients are extremely busy people. We have a massive corporate transition to initiate today. We need the judge to stamp these transfer documents immediately so my clients can take their rightful place at the helm of the Sterling Empire. We do not have time to sit around waiting on procedural formalities." The bailiff simply stared at him, entirely unimpressed by the performance, and told him to wait until the case was called. Davis scoffed, turning back to Terence to make a joke about the sluggish pace of public servants. They were completely unified in their delusion. It was time for me to make my entrance. I stepped out from the adjacent corridor and began my walk toward courtroom 4B. I did not wear mourning clothes. I did not wear the subdued, modest attire they expected from a defeated woman crawling away from their fortune. I wore an impeccably tailored bone-white crepe suit. It was a statement piece radiating clean, untouchable, quiet power. My hair was styled flawlessly, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute serenity. I carried a single black leather portfolio containing the final copies of my limited liability corporation protections and the firewall agreements Kenneth had finalized. The clicking of my heels drew their attention. The boisterous conversation among the Sterlings abruptly ceased. Beatrice whipped her head around, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits as she took in my appearance. She had expected me to arrive looking haggard, broken, and thoroughly destroyed by my eviction from the penthouse. Instead, she was looking at a woman who appeared entirely unbothered by the loss of a billionaire estate. I walked past them without breaking my stride. I did not offer a greeting. I did not acknowledge their presence. I simply walked directly to Kenneth, who offered me a slight, respectful nod. Beatrice leaned close to Terence, but her voice was sharp and loud enough for me to hear perfectly. "Look at her," Beatrice hissed, her tone dripping with venomous spite. "She is wearing white to a probate hearing. She is trying so desperately to look expensive. She probably spent the last of her savings on that suit just to save face. It is pathetic. She knows she has lost everything, and she is just putting on a brave front for the lawyers. Terence snorted, adjusting his cuffs. Let her play dress-up mother. By lunchtime, she will not have a dime to her name, and I will have absolute control over the company accounts. She can wear whatever she wants to the unemployment office. Vanessa chimed in, crossing her arms over her chest. I am honestly surprised she even showed up. I figured she would be too embarrassed to face us after getting completely legally outmaneuvered. Davis ran circles around her little neighborhood lawyer. I stood next to Kenneth, listening to their vicious whispers. I felt no anger. I felt no urge to defend myself. Their insults were nothing more than the desperate noises of people trying to convince themselves of their own supremacy. I looked at Kenneth, and a microscopic smile passed between us. We knew the exact contents of the document sitting on the judge's bench. We knew the $40 million anvil suspended directly above their heads. The heavy wooden doors to courtroom 4B finally swung open, and the bailiff instructed us to enter. We filed into the polished mahogany room, taking our respective places at the heavy counsel tables. Kenneth and I sat on the left, maintaining our absolute composure. Attorney Davis, Beatrice Terrence, and Vanessa crowded around the right table, whispering excitedly among themselves. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Beatrice sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her diamond rings catching the overhead light, looking every inch the victorious matriarch. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison entered from his chambers. He was an older, stern-looking man with a reputation for rigorous scrutiny. He sat down heavily behind the elevated bench, adjusting his reading glasses as he opened the massive file containing the Sterling estate transfer documents. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge flipped through the thick stack of paper. He turned page after page, his brow furrowing slightly as he scanned the dense legal language Kenneth had meticulously crafted. I watched Attorney Davis shift his weight restlessly in his expensive leather chair. He wanted the gavel to fall. He wanted his victory. Judge Harrison stopped flipping pages. He took a deep breath and looked directly at me. Mrs. Sterling, the scope of this transfer is absolute. I need to ask you one final time. Are you absolutely sure you want to forfeit your marital rights to the entire estate? I slowly turned my head. I locked eyes with Beatrice. I am absolutely certain, Your Honor. Judge Harrison held my gaze for a long moment, searching my face for any hint of hesitation, coercion, or regret. Finding only absolute, unwavering conviction, he slowly nodded his head. He lowered his reading glasses to the bridge of his nose and turned his attention back to the massive stack of transfer documents resting on the polished mahogany bench. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, amplifying the rustle of the thick parchment pages turning under the judge's hands. He picked up his wooden gavel, tapped it lightly against the sound block, and gave his final verbal authorization for the transfer of the Sterling estate. Attorney Davis practically vibrated out of his leather chair. The moment the judge signaled his approval, the smug lawyer lurched forward, his hands grasping the thick binding of the transfer portfolio. He did not bother to review the pages one final time. He did not suggest that his clients take a moment to scan the dense legal paragraphs Kenneth Wright had so meticulously constructed. Davis was entirely blinded by the promise of his exorbitant legal fees and the thrill of what he perceived to be a swift, crushing victory over a local attorney. He slid the heavy stack of documents across the polished surface of the defense table, pushing them aggressively toward Terrence and Beatrice. "Here we go," Davis whispered loudly, tapping a manicured finger directly onto the signature lines. "Right here at the top, Terrence. And Beatrice, your signature goes on the second page for the real estate and personal property transfers. Just sign on the dotted lines and we can all get out of here." Terrence did not hesitate. He did not pause to read the headers, the subclauses, or the indemnification waivers. He did not notice the thick section labeled Exhibit B nestled quietly beneath the primary transfer agreements. He only saw the bold, capitalized letters spelling out Sole Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Enterprises. His eyes dilated with pure, unadulterated greed. He practically ripped the silver fountain pen right out of Attorney Davis's hand. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the heavy barrel of the pen, his eagerness bordering on frantic desperation. Terence leaned over the table, his bespoke suit straining against his shoulders as he pressed the pen to the parchment. He signed his name with large, aggressive loops, claiming his fabricated throne with aggressive enthusiasm. He pressed so hard, the ink bled slightly into the thick paper. He was legally binding himself to the entire corporate structure, completely unaware that he was attaching his personal liability to a $40 million federal black hole. He lifted the pen with a sharp flick of his wrist, his chest expanding as he stared at his own signature. He truly believed he had just conquered the world. With a self-satisfied smirk, Terence slid the massive stack of documents toward his mother. Beatrice adjusted her diamond brooch, her posture rigid and triumphant. She took the silver pen from her son with slow, deliberate movements, treating the instrument as if it were a royal scepter. She looked across the aisle at me, her eyes flashing with absolute contempt. She wanted me to watch her take everything she believed I had stolen from her family. She wanted to ensure I witnessed the exact moment my brief reign in her son's penthouse came to an end. Beatrice lowered her gaze to the second page. She saw her name printed clearly beneath the matriarchal estate transfer heading. She saw the deed to the Gold Coast penthouse, listed clearly, completely ignoring the mundane assumption of liabilities clause buried just beneath it. She signed her name with elegant sweeping cursive. Every curve of her signature sealed her fate, binding her directly to the impending bank foreclosures and the catastrophic criminal fallout that David had left behind. She capped the silver pen with a sharp, definitive click and handed the entire portfolio back to Attorney Davis. Davis gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the table to straighten the stack. He handed them to the court clerk, who passed them up to Judge Harrison for final certification. The judge reviewed the signatures, comparing them against the requisite notary seals and witness lines. He stamped the pages with a heavy metallic thud that echoed through the quiet courtroom. "Let the record show," Judge Harrison announced, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute, irrevocable finality, that Terence and Beatrice Sterling have assumed full, unconditional ownership of Sterling Enterprises and all associated assets, properties, and liabilities. This transfer is hereby certified and recognized by the state of Illinois. The estate of David Sterling is officially closed and transferred. The gavel struck the sound block with a sharp crack. The sound was the starting pistol for the Sterling family's celebration. The tension that had held their bodies rigid instantly evaporated, replaced by an outpouring of toxic, arrogant jubilation. Terence leaned back in his chair, hooking his thumbs into his suit pockets. He stretched his legs out under the table and fixed his gaze directly on me. His face was twisted into a malicious, triumphant smirk. He looked at me as if I were an insect he had just successfully crushed beneath the heel of his Italian leather shoe. "Better luck next time, sweetheart," Terence sneered across the aisle, his voice carrying perfectly in the quiet room. "You gave it your best shot, but the house always wins. Enjoy the bus ride back to the South Side." Vanessa leaned over the wooden railing separating the gallery from the council tables, grabbing her mother's shoulder in excitement. She could not contain her venomous glee. She looked at my pristine white suit and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "We are going to pop a $5,000 bottle of champagne tonight," Vanessa whispered loudly, ensuring her voice traveled across the aisle. "We are going to drink a toast to the trash finally taking itself out. Do not worry, Nia. We will make sure the interior decorators throw all your cheap, tasteless furniture straight into the dumpster where it belongs. The penthouse is going to smell like actual money again." Beatrice placed a hand over Vanessa's arm, projecting a fake aura of dignified restraint, though her eyes were dancing with cruel satisfaction. "Let her be, Vanessa," Beatrice commanded softly. "She has suffered a tremendous loss today. It is only fair we allow her to retreat in peace. She has a very long, very difficult life ahead of her. We must focus on restoring our family's rightful prestige." I sat perfectly still, absorbing their insults like rain hitting a stone wall. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I felt the smooth, cold plastic of the black pen resting in my hand. I had used it to sign away my rights to sever my legal ties to David's radioactive empire. I slowly, deliberately twisted the cap back onto the pen. The soft click of the plastic locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I turned to my left and calmly handed the pen to Kenneth Wright. Kenneth took it without a word, His expression entirely neutral, though I could see the faint, dangerous glimmer of amusement hiding behind his glasses. He knew exactly what had just transpired. He had built the guillotine, and the Sterlings had just willingly placed their necks on the block and pulled the lever themselves. I slowly leaned back into my leather chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. I looked at Terence, whose chest was puffed out in arrogant victory. I looked at Beatrice, who was already mentally redesigning the penthouse. I looked at Vanessa, who was clinging to her designer bag, as if it were a shield against reality. They were smiling, laughing, congratulating themselves on their brilliant legal maneuvering. They were completely entirely blind to the impending devastation. The trap had officially snapped shut. There was no going back now. The signatures were certified. The transfer was a matter of public record. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and a legion of furious creditors were now legally pointing their weapons directly at Terence and Beatrice Sterling. They had demanded the crown, and I had gladly handed it to them. They were about to discover that the crown was forged from $40 million of stolen federal funds. I remained completely silent, basking in the quiet, devastating perfection of their self-inflicted ruin. I simply sat there, radiating quiet power, absolutely ready to watch their entire empire burn to the ground. Kenneth Wright broke the absolute stillness of the courtroom. He pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping softly against the polished floor, and stood to his full height. He did not possess the theatrical, overbearing flair of Richard Davis, nor did he need it. True power never requires a megaphone. Kenneth reached down to our counsel table and picked up a thick, unmarked manila folder that had been resting face down for the entire duration of the hearing. He held it for a brief second, his fingers gripping the edges of the heavy stock paper, fully aware of the devastating arsenal contained within its bindings. With a polite, almost chilling smile playing at the corners of his mouth, Kenneth reached across the narrow aisle separating our tables. He slid the heavy envelope directly in front of Attorney Davis. It landed with a soft, weighted thud against the polished mahogany, a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous space of Judge Harrison's courtroom. "Now that the transfer is legally binding and irrevocable," Kenneth said, his voice projecting a crisp, clinical authority that cut through the lingering celebratory energy of the defense table. "As required by law, we are formally handing over Exhibit B. This contains the current financial disclosures and active liabilities of Sterling Enterprises, effective immediately upon the execution of the estate transfer." Attorney Davis let out a dismissive, arrogant scoff. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down at the folder as if it were an annoying piece of junk mail interrupting his victory parade. He clearly assumed it was standard procedural paperwork, mundane tax filings, minor operational expenses, or trivial outstanding invoices that naturally came with inheriting a global empire. He did not understand that he was looking at a financial autopsy report. He was so completely insulated by his own monumental ego and his client's delusions of grandeur that he failed to recognize the executioner standing directly in front of him. Davis flipped open the manila cover with a careless, theatrical flick of his wrist. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, adopting a posture of supreme, untouchable boredom. He casually scanned the top half of the first page, his eyes darting across the bold black text with complete indifference. Then his eyes stopped moving. The arrogant swagger that had been permanently plastered across his face since he strutted into the courthouse hallway began to falter. It did not vanish instantly. It died a slow, agonizing death. Davis blinked rapidly, leaning forward and pulling the document closer to his face, as if the physical proximity might alter the terrifying words printed on the page. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his tight-starched collar. He flipped to the second page. His movements were no longer smooth, confident, or practiced. They were sharp, jerky, and erratic. The thick parchment rattled loudly in the silent courtroom as his hands began to tremble. It was a subtle tremor at first, just a slight, uncontrollable vibration in his fingertips, but it quickly spread through his hands, traveling up his forearms and into his shoulders. He flipped to the third page, then the fourth and the fifth, his eyes widening to the point of straining as he scanned paragraphs of dense legal and financial terminology that spelled absolute, unmitigated catastrophe. The swagger evaporated entirely, melting off his face, like wax under a heat lamp. He physically paled, the healthy tanned color draining rapidly from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray pallor. A distinct sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, the moisture catching the harsh fluorescent lighting from the ceiling above. He was frantically flipping through the pages, now his initial boredom completely replaced by raw, unfiltered, paralyzing panic. The contents of Exhibit B were not minor operational disclosures. They were a relentless, suffocating barrage of apocalyptic revelations. There were copies of the formal expedited subpoenas issued directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, demanding immediate, unrestricted access to the offshore accounts David had utilized to aggressively funnel illicit funds. There were the preliminary drafts of sealed indictments prepared by the Department of Justice, meticulously outlining the systemic wire fraud, international money laundering, and massive tax evasion that had artificially kept Sterling Enterprises afloat for the past 5 years. And then came the financial ledgers. Davis stared at columns of red ink that stretched endlessly for pages. The corporate accounts were not just empty, they were violently hemorrhaging money. The ledgers detailed massive high-interest bridge loans leveraged against commercial assets that no longer legally existed. They detailed severe, immediate penalties for defaulted international contracts and immediate payment demands from a legion of furious, defrauded creditors. The final inescapable tally at the bottom of the summary page was circled in thick black ink. It was a terrifying, insurmountable figure, a financial black hole that would unequivocally swallow anyone attached to it. The sheer scale of the devastation was breathtaking, a terrifying $40 million debt ledger. Davis realized in that horrifying instant exactly what he had facilitated. His clients had not just claimed a lucrative company. They had legally attached their personal names, their uncontested signatures, and their individual unprotected liability to a colossal criminal enterprise that was currently sitting directly in the crosshairs of the federal government. By forcing the immediate, unconditional transfer of all assets and liabilities without a single shred of due diligence, Terrence and Beatrice had willingly legally volunteered to take the absolute fall for David's monumental crimes. And Davis, in his arrogant rush to secure his exorbitant legal fees and humiliate opposing counsel, had happily handed them the pen and guided their hands to the dotted line. The atmosphere at this defense table shifted from toxic jubilation to profound, unsettling confusion. Beatrice, who was already mentally picking out new drapes for the penthouse and planning her societal comeback tour, noticed the drastic change in her lawyer's demeanor. The triumphant, aristocratic glow on her face faded into a mask of sharp, patrician irritation. She despised anything that interrupted her moments of glory, and Davis's sudden trembling silence was actively ruining her victory lap. She tapped her manicured, diamond-clad nails impatiently against the wooden table, the sound echoing like a ticking clock in the otherwise silent room. She shot a withering glare at me, assuming I had filed some desperate, last-minute grievance just to stall their inevitable triumph. She was thoroughly mistaken. "What is the delay, Richard?" Beatrice demanded, her voice sharp, authoritative, and dripping with upper-class annoyance. "Are there more papers to file? Let us finish this up and get out of this dreadful building. We have a private celebration to attend, and Terrence needs to formally address the board of directors before noon. Stop wasting our time." Davis did not respond immediately. He could not tear his eyes away from the terrifying Department of Justice seals printed on the pages before him. His breathing had become audibly shallow and rapid. He looked exactly like a man who had just confidently stepped onto a landmine and heard the definitive metallic click of the trigger engaging beneath his Italian leather boot. "Richard!" Terrence barked, his voice laced with the exact same entitled, arrogant impatience as his mother. He leaned over his side of the table, trying to catch a glimpse of the documents causing his lawyer to malfunction. "What is the problem? Is there a typo on the deeds? Just cross it out and initial it on the margins. We own the building now. We own the whole damn block. The minor details do not matter anymore. Wrap it up." Davis slowly, agonizingly looked up from the manila folder. The sheer unadulterated horror radiating from his eyes caused Terence to freeze completely mid-sentence. Davis stared at his clients, his face completely devoid of all color, his chest heaving uncontrollably under his expensive pinstripe suit. He looked at Beatrice sitting tall and regal. He looked at Terence, puffing his chest out in a counterfeit display of corporate dominance. He looked at Vanessa gripping her Birkin bag and waiting to gloat. He took in their diamonds, their designer coats, and their blind, unearned arrogance. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked, reduced to a dry, terrified rasp. He swallowed heavily, fighting desperately to push the words past the absolute suffocating panic constricting his throat. His entire career, his reputation, and his firm were now inextricably linked to this catastrophic failure. The courtroom was dead silent, waiting for the executioner to announce the sentence they had unknowingly signed up for. Davis stared directly at Beatrice and Terence, his eyes wide with a terror that they were about to inherit. He felt completely paralyzed by fear. You did not inherit a billion-dollar company. Davis whispered, his voice cracking and trembling so violently it barely carried across the narrow expanse of the polished wooden table. You just inherited $40 million in federal debt. The silence that followed Richard Davis's horrifying revelation was absolute, but it lasted for only a fraction of a second. It was the terrifying vacuum that precedes a catastrophic detonation. Then the courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Beatrice Sterling let out a sound that did not belong in a civilized setting. It was a high, piercing shriek, a guttural wail of sheer aristocratic terror that bounced off the mahogany walls and rattled the heavy brass fixtures. She recoiled from the manila folder as if it were a live grenade, her manicured hands flying to her throat, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure denial. She adamantly refused to believe the words her expensive lawyer had just spoken. Her reality, meticulously built on a foundation of perceived superiority and stolen wealth, was violently collapsing. She demanded that Davis stop speaking nonsense. She demanded that he fix whatever clerical error was printed on those pages. But there was no error. Terence lunged across the counsel table. His previous aura of untouchable corporate dominance vanished in an instant, replaced by the frantic, uncoordinated movements of a cornered animal. He snatched the thick folder directly out of Davis's trembling hands, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the heavy paper. Terence's eyes widened in sheer terror as he stared down at the documents. He did not see a minor accounting discrepancy. He saw the cold, hard, indisputable evidence of a massive, federally investigated, completely bankrupt Ponzi scheme. He saw the staggering ledgers detailing $40 million in liabilities. And right there at the very bottom of the primary transfer agreement, glaring back at him in dark, unsmudged ink, was his own aggressive signature. He had proudly and willingly locked himself in as the chief executive officer of a sinking ship, actively volunteering to absorb the entire weight of the federal indictments looming on the horizon. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The custom-tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a straitjacket. Attorney Davis was hyperventilating, his professional composure utterly destroyed. The lucrative retainer he had envisioned was gone, replaced by the terrifying prospect of a massive malpractice lawsuit and intense federal scrutiny. He spun around to face Judge Harrison, waving his hands in a frantic, desperate display of backpedaling. He practically threw himself over the wooden barrier, begging the judge to immediately reverse the signatures. He loudly claimed fraud, citing willful deception and bad faith negotiation. He argued that his clients had been deliberately misled regarding the financial health of the Sterling estate, demanding that the court tear up the transfer documents and restore the previous ownership structure. His voice reached a hysterical pitch, echoing with the panic of a man watching his entire career evaporate into thin air. Kenneth Wright did not raise his voice. He did not rush. He calmly adjusted his glasses and stood up, buttoning his understated navy suit jacket. He addressed the court with the smooth, surgical precision of a master tactician who had anticipated every single move. He politely yet firmly pointed out that Attorney Davis and his clients were given ample, legally mandated opportunity to review every single page of the documents before signing. Kenneth reminded the court that it was Attorney Davis who had aggressively demanded the immediate expedition of the hearing, willfully choosing to bypass standard due diligence in his rush to secure control of the assets. Furthermore, Kenneth smoothly reminded Judge Harrison that Nia had explicitly on the permanent court record given them a final warning. She had verbally asked Terrence and Beatrice if they were absolutely sure they wanted everything David left behind, including every single obligation and liability. They had enthusiastically confirmed their desires. Judge Harrison, his expression hardened into a mask of judicial intolerance, slammed his heavy wooden gavel down against the sound block, immediately cutting off Davis's frantic sputtering. The judge sternly informed the defense counsel that buyer's remorse, particularly when fueled by willful ignorance and blinding arrogance, does not constitute legal fraud. The transfer was officially complete. The documents were certified. The debt belonged entirely unequivocally to Terrence and Beatrice Sterling. The finality of the judge's ruling hit the defense table like a physical shockwave. Vanessa was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she clutched her expensive designer handbag against her stomach, her eyes darting frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape hatch that did not exist. Beatrice was slumped back in her chair, her aristocratic posture completely broken, staring blankly at the ceiling, while quiet, uncontrollable sobs racked her body. Terrence looked as though he might physically be ill, his hands shaking violently as they hovered over the catastrophic documents he had so eagerly signed. I stood up slowly. I took a moment to smooth the fabric of my bespoke white blazer, fastening the single pearl button with deliberate, unhurried grace. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I looked down at the hyperventilating family, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their self-inflicted destruction. They had been so consumed by their hatred for me, so blinded by their greed and their relentless need to maintain a facade of generational wealth, that they had willingly marched themselves directly into a federal slaughterhouse. I locked eyes with Terrence, holding his panicked gaze, and then shifted my attention to Beatrice. My voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of emotion. It cut through the chaotic sounds of their panic with absolute clarity. "You wanted the Sterling legacy," I stated, my words ringing across the silent courtroom. "You fought for it. You insulted my background, my intelligence, and my big mama's hard work to get it. You were utterly convinced that you were inherently superior, that you deserved this empire simply because you shared a last name. Well, congratulations. You are now the proud owners of a federal crime." I paused, letting the devastating reality of my words sink deep into their fractured minds. I looked at Beatrice, whose tear-streaked face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated ruin. "Enjoy the penthouse," I added, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "The bank is foreclosing on it on Tuesday." I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. I picked up my black leather portfolio from the table, signaling the absolute conclusion of my business with the Sterling family. Kenneth Wright picked up his briefcase, offering the judge a polite nod before turning to join me. Together we walked away from the counsel table, our footsteps echoing with a steady, synchronized rhythm against the polished floorboards. We did not look back. As we pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the bright fluorescent lit corridor, the sounds of their devastation followed us. We left behind the echoing sounds of Beatrice sobbing uncontrollably, her wails of despair bouncing off the mahogany walls. We heard Vanessa screaming hysterically at Terrence, her shrill voice accusing him of ruining their lives, cursing his aggressive stupidity and his failure to read the documents. And beneath the shrieking and the crying, we could hear Terrence completely breaking down his arrogant facade, utterly demolished by the crushing weight of a $40 million debt and impending federal charges. Their entire world had been reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes entirely by their own hands. I walked down the courthouse hallway with Kenneth by my side, feeling a profound, absolute sense of freedom. The heavy crown of the Sterling Empire had finally found its rightful owners, and the resulting execution was a masterpiece of poetic justice. I inhaled deeply, tasting the pristine victory that tasted sweeter than any expensive champagne they could ever purchase. The storm I had weathered for years had finally broken, leaving nothing but clear skies ahead. My mind immediately shifted gears, leaving the wreckage of the Sterling dynasty firmly in the past. I possessed a $25 million logistics platform to oversee global contracts, to negotiate, and a future entirely under my own command. I stepped through the massive brass doors of the courthouse and out into the crisp, biting wind of the city. The sun was shining brightly, illuminating the busy streets filled with people rushing to their own destinations, entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had just occurred mere feet away inside the marble walls. Kenneth paused beside a black luxury sedan, waiting at the curb, opening the heavy rear door, and gesturing for me to step inside. We exchanged one final silent look of mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the meticulous strategy we had flawlessly executed. I slid onto the soft leather seat, leaning my head back and closing my eyes as the engine roared to life. The vehicle pulled away from the courthouse, seamlessly merging into the heavy flow of downtown traffic. I was no longer a widow burdened by another man's sins. I was officially, entirely, undeniably free at long last. 3 months passed rapidly, bringing a brutal, inescapable, and completely unforgiving karma to the Sterling family. The empire they had so desperately craved collapsed with spectacular, devastating violence. The federal government descended upon Sterling enterprises like a relentless swarm of locusts, aggressively freezing every asset, forcefully seizing every property, and tearing relentlessly through decades of David's fraudulent ledgers. Terrence, having legally bound himself as the sole managing director and chief executive officer, bore the absolute crushing brunt of the devastation. He was currently facing multiple severe federal indictments and the very real, terrifying prospect of significant jail time. He spent his long days trapped in windowless interrogation rooms, desperately trying to untangle a catastrophic financial web he lacked the fundamental intelligence to even comprehend. His arrogant bluster had been entirely replaced by a pathetic whining panic as federal prosecutors methodically and ruthlessly dismantled his life. Beatrice suffered a rapid public downfall that was equally poetic and utterly humiliating. The impending bank foreclosures I had promised materialized with ruthless, staggering efficiency. She was forcibly evicted from her beloved Gold Coast penthouse, escorted completely off the premises by armed marshals, while her wealthy neighbors watched in shock. Stripped of her stolen wealth and her fabricated prestige, she was forced to quickly liquidate her entire collection of designer clothes, vintage jewelry, and antique furniture just to afford basic living expenses. She relocated to a tiny rundown apartment on the dark outskirts of the city, a place she would have previously refused to even drive past. Her high society church friends, the exact same women who had once hung on her every single word, completely shunned her. They stopped returning her calls entirely, immediately deleted her from their prestigious charity committees, and treated her like a highly contagious disease. Her carefully curated aristocratic illusion was completely, irrevocably dead. Vanessa did exactly what a desperate parasite does when its generous host dies. She immediately filed for a highly publicized, deeply acrimonious divorce from Terrence. She eagerly unleashed a ruthless legal team to secure whatever pathetic pennies remained safely hidden from the aggressive federal investigators, loudly claiming she had been entirely ignorant of the family's extensive criminal dealings. She happily abandoned the Sterling sinking ship without a single glance backward, leaving her brother and mother to slowly drown in the terrible ruin they had so eagerly orchestrated together. The dark scene of their absolute destruction stood in bright, stark contrast to my new reality. I sat comfortably behind a sleek glass desk in my stunning sunlit corner office, prominently located on the top floor of a beautiful corporate building I now owned outright. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a gorgeous panoramic view of the bustling city skyline, serving as a daily reminder of the tremendous heights I had successfully reached completely on my own terms. The space was incredibly bright, boldly modern, and entirely free of the suffocating toxic shadows that had previously defined my wasted time with the Sterling family. Resting securely on the pristine glass surface of my desk was a freshly printed copy of the absolute most prestigious business magazine in the entire country. My face graced the glossy cover, prominently accompanied by a bold black headline highlighting my latest industry achievements. The massive feature article profiled me as a leading revolutionary tech innovator, meticulously detailing the aggressive, unmitigated success of my $20 million logistics platform. It highly praised my strategic vision, my relentless work ethic, and the undeniable, unmatched power of my independent business acumen. There was absolutely no mention of David, no reference to the disgraced Sterling name, and no connection whatsoever to the fraudulent empire that had rightfully crumbled into thick dust. It was a beautiful, permanent monument to my own unadulterated brilliance. I comfortably leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and took a deep, deeply satisfying breath, reflecting quietly on the brutal, exhausting ordeal that had directly brought me to this exact triumphant moment in time. I slowly looked away from the magazine cover and addressed the incredible journey directly, proudly speaking the undeniable truth aloud to the bright, empty room. They thought they could break me because they thought my power came from their name, but my power came from my roots, my mind, and the woman who raised me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't fighting for a seat at their toxic table, it's letting them gorge themselves on their own greed until they choke. They had fundamentally misunderstood the very core nature of true strength. They erroneously believed that stolen wealth and unearned influence were inherited rights, magical shields that would forever protect them from any real consequence. They foolishly looked at my South Side background and saw a weakness to be exploited, completely failing to recognize the indestructible iron armor my grandmother had flawlessly forged around my spirit. Big Mama had taught me exactly how to spot a predator, how to patiently weather a violent storm, and how to intelligently build a lasting kingdom with my own two hands. The Sterling family demanded the crown I wore entirely blind to the fact that I had intentionally laced it with deadly poison before handing it over to them. This is the absolute, ultimate, undeniable truth you must carry forward into your own beautiful life. Protect your internal peace with absolute ruthless determination at all costs. Never allow arrogant, entitled individuals to falsely convince you that your innate worth is somehow tied to their validation or their physical proximity. When they foolishly try to exclude you from their elite spaces, do not ever beg for a simple invitation. Walk away, harness your unique brilliance, and build your own spectacular table. Construct an empire so magnificent and successful that their toxic little world becomes entirely irrelevant. Trust your sharp instincts, honor your deep roots, and never let anyone diminish your bright, shining light. You are the master architect of your own grand destiny, and your greatest victory will always be your absolute, completely unbothered success.